Wonderful. Very good. So I am ready whenever you are with any questions that you may have for me.
Excellent. So the more motif or theme today will be more revolving around the ring cycle in Lord of the Ring. And the first question is, do you see Wagner and J.R.R. Tolkien as having competing views in regards to the ring cycle in Lord of the Rings? If so, which is superior? I noticed that your video on the topic had a lot of music from Wagner's ring cycle in it.
Mm. That's that's a very good question, actually. That was unexpected, but I'm glad someone asked that. I love Wagner, and of course, I love Tolkien. I love them both. Of course, let's say the motifs of both individuals, of course, are derived from very similar sources, as we know. Very similar mindset, very similar sort of heroic and noble way of viewing the world. Very much a way of viewing the world in which things are seen in very stark terms, which is good, actually. Today, it's interesting, of course, in our very liberal, new age sort of very effeminate way of viewing reality. Today, of course, people don't like stark things. People don't like the idea of good versus evil. People love gray areas, fluffy areas where there's lots of room to maneuver, i.e., to not do the right thing. That's what people love today. But in actuality, in the past, it was understood that the fluffy areas were meaningless, the gray areas were meaningless, and reality needs to be understood truly in stark terms of basically black and white almost, good versus evil. And you see this theme constant in both Wagner and Tolkien. Of course, they worked in very different media, one being a composer, the other being an author. As far as which is better, which is worse, I wouldn't want to categorize one as better or worse. They both made very valuable contributions in reviving the idea of the ancient, reviving very traditionalist notions of, again, good versus evil, of the importance of spirituality, of the heroic search for truth and for justice, etc. Many, many themes are shared by both of these individuals. So I wouldn't really want to say, oh, this person is better than that person. Again, they were working in two different media, and I personally find inspiration from both. I love Parsifal by Wagner very specifically, and of course Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. I find that they complement each other very nicely. And, I'm not one of these people, I'm not an armchair scholar who likes to nitpick and analyze individuals like this to death. Again, they both had wonderful contributions that hopefully people can appreciate today, because there's a lot of truth in both the musical compositions of Wagner and the writings of Tolkien that we need to learn from today very, very much.
Thank you so much for the insight on that. I personally don't think that they conflict, but you definitely see some of the aforementioned armchair scholars talking about that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You do see that quite a bit. And of course, they were both individuals. They lived in different eras, number one. They had different, let's say, somewhat different cultural upbringings. One was German, one was British, of German extraction, but still raised in a British culture. Politically, they were not the same. Wagner went through himself several transformations politically. He changed his views on different things over time. So they were different individuals. But again, I think it's important to take the best from both of them and to see them as complementary.
Thank you. I think that's very wise advice. Obviously, I love both of them a lot, beyond words. I've always been fascinated by Wagner. But the next question ties into that. In your video discussing Lord of the Rings, you mentioned Saruman, specifically getting into Lord of the Rings, represents what today would be called the Luciferian, or someone who uses spiritual practice to do evil. Is Lucifer purely an evil archetype?
All right, this I knew this question was eventually going to come. not necessarily in this exact form. And it is something that very much needs to be addressed. And actually, in order to not make this answer extremely long, which honestly, this theme alone I could probably talk about for several hours in a very systematic way, I want to make this very practical. And rather than talk about this figure of Lucifer and whether he is indeed a good being or a bad being, because there is indeed some debate about that, which honestly I find less interesting than the more practical aspects of this. Rather than Lucifer, I would like to talk just for a short time about Luciferianism, and in the modern context, because truthfully, as far as whether thousands of years ago this Lucifer character really represented true light and wisdom and something good, or whether he truly was a demonic being, honestly, that's less important than what is practiced today under the name of Luciferianism. And this is something I again want to kind of touch the surface on a little bit today. Maybe the next time we get together we can go deeper into this. But this is something that I have actually a very strong view about, because I understand Luciferianism. I actually understand the entire concept of Lucifer and Satanism, left-hand path, so-called, etc., extremely well. In fact, from a scholarly perspective, there are very few people who have actually studied this, researched into this, and who understand it better than me. And let me just first begin by saying this, and this is an unequivocal statement that I need to make to anyone who considers themselves to be a follower of Sanatana Dharma in any form whatsoever. Anyone who considers themselves to be a Vaishnava, anyone who considers themselves to be a follower of Dharma or a Dharma warrior. And this is the statement that I need to make on this. Luciferianism, again, under that general term, is diametrically opposed to everything that Sanatana Dharma stands for. And what I mean by Luciferianism is indeed any sort of so-called religious path that exalts the ego, where they see it as the duty of an individual human being to become a star in the heavens, to semi-quote Aleister Crowley. That is celebration of ego. The idea that the reason why we are alive is to maximize our ego to the furthest degree. Well, for anyone who has read one page of Prabhupada, for anyone who has read one verse of the Bhagavad Gita, for anyone who has read one paragraph of any of the Gospels of Jesus, etc., we understand that that conception, that idea that we are meant to encourage false ego, that is diametrically opposed to everything that is truly spiritual. And it's very, very unfortunate that I have seen over the years that due to ignorance, and it's true ignorance, it's a true lack of knowledge, of just factual knowledge, knowledge of history, knowledge of philosophy, etc. I've actually seen that over the years there are some well-meaning people, both in certain political circles, but also people who claim to be following Dharma, who, for example, they take great inspiration from Aleister Crowley. Let me explain to people who may not understand this. Please look at Prabhupada. If you're listening to my voice right now, I mean quite literally, if you have a photo of Prabhupada, if you have a book by Prabhupada and there's a photo of him, take it out and look at that photo. Aleister Crowley is the opposite of Prabhupada in every way conceivable. And again, as far as going in depth, maybe in the future we can go very in depth into why this is the case, point by point by point by point. But again, true spirituality asks us to think in terms of transcending falsity, transcending untruth, embracing that which is good, embracing that which is of the nature of consciousness, both our own consciousness and then the supreme consciousness, Bhagavan, Sri Krishna. And And what Luciferianism, and again, under any of its modern terms, whether it's Crowleyanism, so-called left-hand path, Satanism, etc., encourages the very opposite of everything that Dharma encourages. So as far as Satan as an individual figure in history, I mean, that's something we can talk about in the future. I don't think it's actually very important. I know there are some individuals who are good writers in the late 20th century who exalt Lucifer and feel that Lucifer was just a very misunderstood, rebellious individual who brought wisdom to people. Personally, I would disagree with that. And again, for reasons that are very deep that we really don't want to go very deeply into now, because we'll be talking about this for the duration of the hour. But let me just leave it at that. Luciferianism, the teachings of Aleister Crowley, the teachings of left-hand path, whether it's tantric or not tantric, this is what is technically termed Asura Marga, sometimes Asura Dharma. You find both terms. So there is Sanatana Dharma, there is Vaishnava Dharma, there is the Dharma that originates from God, the path by which we know God, but then there is the path of the Asuras, Asura Marga. Luciferianism, Aleister Crowley, left-hand path are technically considered to be Asura Marga. This is the path of the demons. And we are not meant to follow this path. We're not meant to take inspiration from this path. It doesn't matter if Aleister Crowley was an interesting individual. He was interesting because he was sick and crazy and evil. If people find that interesting, well, that's unfortunate for them. We live in an age of titillation. We live in an age where people get bored very easily. And if they find someone who is different, has different ideas, even if that person is an evil, satanic abuser of other individuals, they find that interesting. That's very sad. We are not interested in Aleister Crowley or Luciferianism or left-hand path in any manner whatsoever. And that's my little brief statement on that. Again, maybe in the future we can go much deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. In the future, that would be very interesting. I think that was a very good answer, and it's very, very good to clear those up. And as always, you don't mince words. There's no mistaking that for anything that it's not.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. Again, this is part of, for lack of a better word, just to state it in a very common way, this is part of the difficulty of the fluffiness of modernity, where people don't have discerning abilities anymore. Very few people. I mean, obviously some do. But for the most part, as far as the masses, as far as the NPCs out there, as far as the typical individual who just kind of goes on with their life and, once in a while they'll kind of look at something on the internet that's semi-spiritual and get a little bit interested, but they don't really have any actual knowledge or discerning ability. What happens is people will just, again, without discernment, without discrimination, pick up from everywhere, not understanding that, well, would you eat food from everywhere? Is all food the same? Either something created by a wonderful chef at a banquet or half a hot dog that you find lying on a sidewalk. Is food just food? Or do you have the ability to make that distinction? Well, I'm not going to pick up that half-eaten hot dog from a sidewalk, number one, because I'm vegetarian. Number two, because it was just there on a sidewalk. God knows what its origin or its history is. In the same way that we know we wouldn't do that, well, we have to be the same way spiritually, philosophically, as far as our worldview. We can't just feel that, well, everyone had something to say and, oh, it's all the same. No, it's not all the same. Some individuals who claim to be spiritual teachers, either today or in the past, were evil, were demonic. Some obviously were real, some were good. We should be able to know the difference between the two. And for any individual who is inspired, and again, specifically by Prabhupada, and by anyone who is clearly a God-realized being, whether it's Jesus or Ramanuja or Chaitanya Mahaprabhu or any of these great individuals, A person who finds themselves attracted to such individuals, they need to be able to make the distinction between such true teachers and then frauds and fakes and individuals who are evil personified, like Aleister Crowley, who was teaching literally the opposite. I mean, how can you reconcile two people who are teaching the opposite? Here are individuals who are sages, who are saying, your problem is you're an illusion, and that illusion becomes manifest in you psychologically, in your chitta, in your mind substance, in the form of what is called ahankara, false ego, a false identification of thinking you are X thing when you are not. We have that on the one hand. Again, individuals like all the great rishis. And then on the other hand, we have a tiny number of people like Aleister Crowley who will say, oh, yes, you have an ego, you have a false ego, but guess what? You're meant to celebrate that. You're meant to embrace that. You are meant to explore that to the furthest reaches that your insanity and lust and anger and desire and delusion can take you, and that's our religious path. And yet there are individuals who unthinkingly, and again, it's just due to ignorance, they think these two can be reconciled. Or they think, well, I love Prabhupada, but Aleister Crowley had a few interesting things to say. No, they are diametrically opposed. So much so that, an individual who finds themselves attracted to both must take shelter of Dharma. Please abandon any curiosity, any interest that you have in Aleister Crowley or Luciferianism or Satanism or any of these things. These paths are childish, actually. Again, don't get me going because I can talk about this for many hours. But these are paths that are meant for immature individuals who don't have the inner integrity to follow a path that will be challenging and will make demands of them. The Luciferian paths do the opposite. They ask you to celebrate the worst in yourself, whereas the path of Dharma asks us to bring out the best in ourselves. And that's harder. It's a harder path to bring out the best in ourselves. But why would we want anything less than our best? So, I will stop there.
And again, thank you so much. I can't imagine how helpful that will be to some people to have someone who actually doesn't mince words and who can speak with authority talk about how just completely wrong something like Satanism is. So every once in a while, I see somebody even that claims to have good intentions and then tries to reconcile Satanism with something dharmic, and it goes against everything that anyone good who's actually claiming to be good stands for, especially someone like Crowley.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I will move into the next question there, so we don't, even though we could go on for that for quite a while, and perhaps someday we should, but I will continue with the next question then.
Yes, definitely.
Previously, when we talked, you said there was only written evidence that truly survives about the older European faiths. Sorry, I misworded. The only written evidence that survives about the European faiths are Greco-Roman. How do you view such works as the Poetic Eddas and the Oralinda book?
Oh, interesting. Actually, I don't know if you saw this, but I actually answered that on YouTube in one of the comments there, because we had gotten several questions about the Eddas specifically, and Tulsi actually asked me about that, and we ended up answering that question very in depth in one of the comments. But I'll do that here as well. Yes, several things. First of all, yes, in the last interview, we were talking very specifically about philosophical works, not just any works. Certainly, there are remnants of various writings from pre-Christian Europe that still exist here and there. Very, very little, very, very, very few. But as far as anything overtly philosophical in the strict sense of that word, that only exists in the Greco-Roman writings. I mean, there's no debate about that. There's no person with any knowledge who would debate that. As far as strict philosophy, meaning ethics spoken about in a systematic manner, questions of metaphysics, ontology, logic, epistemology, etc. Again, all written about in a systematic sort of way that only exists in the writings of the Greeks and Romans, as far as pre-Christian Europe. It does not exist anywhere else, including the Eddas. It doesn't exist anywhere. Now, as far as the Eddas themselves, as I stated in that comment that was put in the comment section of the last video that we did, the Eddas themselves are something that are very precious. We have to be extremely thankful that these works even exist, because, my Lord, so much has been lost of the pre-Christian European spiritual paths that there is no word for how tragic this is, as far as how much has been lost. Because, interestingly, we know for a fact that there were scriptures that existed. So, for example, among the Celtic people, they had their own Vedas. And this is not speculation. We know for a fact that the Druids, who were the Brahmanas of the Celtic people, that's exactly what the Druids were. They were the Brahmanas. These individuals, in the same way that the Brahmanas of this very specifically Vedic culture, in the same way that they memorized the Vedic scripture and they carried that down orally from generation to generation to generation until finally it is actually written down. In the same way, the Druids, who were the Brahmanas of the Celtic people, they had their own sacred scriptures that they carried down in the same way, orally and through memory. And they passed this down to their students who memorized them, and on and on. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that with the Druids, it never got written down. So we have none of it. But can you imagine this? They had massive works of literature just like the Vedas. They basically were the Vedas, maybe with just some differences, but it consisted of poetry, of philosophy, of everything. Again, similar to the Vedas, but it is 100% lost. 100%. As far as the Slavic people, to my understanding, very similar. They also had many, many works that were lost. A little bit has been retained, more so with the Slavic people. So, for example, there's the Kalevala, which is a Finnish epic, which is a pre-Christian Finnish epic. That was preserved. And again, this is very similar to a Veda. It was preserved in the same way. It's done in a very specific meter that's meant to be chanted, just like the Veda. It consists of, everything from ancient stories of the gods and goddesses and stories about dharma, about virtue, about natural law, etc. This also was carried down orally in the same way as all these ancient literatures. That is, you memorize, you recite it orally, you pass it down to your students. That still exists. And that can be read, actually, the Kalevala. There's a little bit in a few other Slavic languages, but not much. Now, as far as the Eddas specifically, again, the Eddas are precious. My God, if these were not written down and preserved, we would have known practically nothing about Norse religion, about ancient Norse religion, about the gods and goddesses, about Thor and Odin and Freya and all these people. We would know practically nothing. So we need to be very thankful that the Eddas exist. But at the same time, it has to be understood, of course, that there are the two Eddas, the Poetic and Prose Edda. We need to understand that these were written down by Christians during the Christian era, certainly for somewhat patriotic and nationalistic sorts of reasons. I mean, they recognized that this was the ancient knowledge of their people, so they wanted to preserve them, and thank God that they did. But we have to understand that, of course, these are not scriptures per se. And again, in the comment that I made on YouTube, I explained how certainly there are maybe a small number of modern Asatru people who maybe kind of consider the Eddas to be scripture, but not really. It's recognized by most people that, no, these are extremely important source books, historical source books, but they're not scripture per se. As far as any, let's say, pre-Edda writings we can't say writings, let's say compositions that may have been there orally. Those, of course, are gone. Any books, actual books from the pre-Christian era, sacred books that may have been there, those are completely gone. And more, while the Eddas are important, again, my statement still stands. These are not philosophy books. These are not books that overtly deal with metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, etc., etc. But at the same time, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of the Eddas. Without the Eddas, we would have known nothing, or practically nothing, about the Norse gods and goddesses, the pantheon, a little bit of the pre-Christian, let's say Scandinavian or Norse ethos and culture, etc. So we are eternally indebted to those individuals who created the Eddas. But again, the statement still stands. As far as pre-Christian European philosophy, that exists only in Greco-Roman texts. Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, so many individuals like this. So does that answer the question somewhat?
Yeah, absolutely. As you probably knew, that question was on the top of a lot of people's mind from the last one, and it seems like your Lord of the Rings video has gone through a sudden spike of views ever since the last edit.
Definitely.
Looking for answers.
Yeah, it's been, and I'm very grateful to this. Actually, it's been one of our more popular videos, and that's something that's very important to me because it is actually an important video. I mean, all the videos that we put out are very special in so many ways. They all, they're like spiritual bullets. They have a very specific trajectory and a very specific purpose and a very specific impact. But there are some of our videos that are meant to be more impactful than others, and our video on Lord of the Rings, Dharma and Modernity, I believe it's called, this is one of our more important videos, where we try to basically bring together both of these worlds that are one world really anyway. They're meant to be one world, and that is the world of pre-Christian, European, let's say, culture, religion, etc., with Sanatana Dharma. And that was one of the points of doing that talk, is to exactly show that, yes, they're one. A person can be extremely inspired by pre-Christian European spirituality and still be a follower of Sanatana Dharma. And, again, they are sister religions. They are sister religions. They don't conflict with each other in any way. The only differences that are there are more cultural. They're less important. When you have distinct peoples who live in distinct regions, distinct climactic situations, different challenges that individual peoples may experience, well then of course there will be different kinds of cultural expression. So certainly if you look at ancient Scandinavia of, let's say 2,000 years ago versus ancient India 2,000 years ago, or ancient Persia 2,000 years ago, they're not going to look exactly the same. Again, there will be different cultural expressions. But if you have the insight to go deeper and look at what is the foundation, the worldview by which they govern their societies, they're the same. Pretty much, they're the same. Dharma, if we were to go back 2,000, 3,000 years ago to Norway or to Iceland, and if we were to explain to, let's say, an Asatru priest, oh, this is what we as Vedic people, this is what we believe is natural law. And then if we were to explain Dharma to them, they would look at us and they would say, well, you just explained my religion. you just explained my religion. That's what I was just about to say to you. This is what we would find if we were to go back 2,000 or 3,000 years, and if there were to be, let's say, dialogue between an individual following, let's say, more pure Sanatana Dharma, if there were a dialogue between, let's say, a Vedic priest versus an Asatru priest versus a Roman pagan priest, and if they were to have a dialogue and they were to leave the different little cultural things and the language aside, and if they were to discuss truly, really philosophically, what is the foundation of your worldview, they would all come to absolute agreement. And they would all say, well, I guess we're all following the same thing. So that's what's wonderful. And the Lord of the Rings video was one little attempt to try to show that.
It's absolutely one of my favorite works of yours. But as you could probably guess, I'm not sure if the favorite work actually is the Protecting Yourself from Evil Entities one.
That's another important one, actually. Yeah, that's actually another one of our more important videos that I was hoping would be seen by many, many, many people, and it has been, thankfully. And yeah, there's been a lot of positive feedback on that. And again, yes, with that video as well, we try to, with all of our videos, we try to explain things that no one else has explained before. And with that video as well, talking about protecting yourself from evil entities, yeah, what we attempted to do was to talk about this entire subject in a very authentic way, again, based upon the Vedic teachings, but in a way where people could truly, once and for all, without speculation, understand, okay, number one, are there evil beings? You know, whether it's crazy ghosts who haunt us, or demonic entities, or dark beings, or even humans who are just psychopathic in nature. Number one, are there such beings? Number two, why are they the way that they are? Three, what are the various categories of them? And then finally, yes, how do you combat them? How do you combat them? And of course, the way that you do is you cultivate the opposite. So again, getting back to Dharma versus Luciferianism. Opposite. What do you want spiritually? Do you spiritually want wisdom and peace and goodness and purity, and to truly have meaning in life that extends beyond just your own selfish self-interest? That's Dharma. That is Sanatana Dharma. Or do you want its literal opposite? Do you want to celebrate this little imaginary tick that is constantly bothering us 24 hours a day, that we are entrapped within, that is the false ego, ahankara? Do you want to celebrate that yet even more than we have for how many different lifetimes? That very thing that keeps us in bondage. Do you want to praise your warden? Do you want to praise your warden who has been keeping you in bondage for lifetime after lifetime? Do you want to celebrate darkness and evil and have zero empathy for other living beings? Do you want to be an individual who is an abuser of others? Do you want to be an individual who revels in the idea of other people's suffering? In other words, do you want to be evil? Well, yeah, pick up a book by Aleister Crowley. You'll have a lot of fun. You'll recognize fellow demonic being. So we have to choose. What do we want? What do we want? Which path, which marga do we wish to follow?
I think that leads perfectly into the next question, which is only a minor departure. The question is, in your video, Protecting Yourself from Evil Entities, you talked about how to protect yourself as an individual against harmful spirits by invoking Narasimha. Are there specific Vedic mantras you would recommend for exorcising these kinds of spirits, or does the Narasimha mantra work in these situations as well?
Yes, Narasimha mantra is the mantra to use. That is the most important mantra that one can use. Of course, there are others. There are many others. There are very specific ones to protect yourself from specific beings. There are mantras that are used in exorcism. But this is the most powerful mantra that can be used. And this is the mantra that is recommended in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Om Namo Bhagavate Narasimhaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Narasimhaya. This is the mantra that is recommended in Srimad Bhagavatam itself, which is where this mantra is found and derived from. It's also found in several other Puranas, actually. But this is the most powerful mantra for making demonic beings flee from your presence. See, this is the nature of demonic beings. I alluded to this a little bit in that video, protecting yourself from evil entities. But then also in person, I've spoken to many people about this. This is the nature of all demonic beings, and I have had tremendous personal experience with this. The fuel for such beings is fear. They literally eat fear. They drink fear. They derive their nutrition from our fear. So this is one reason why when we encounter such beings, we must have zero fear. Zero fear. In fact, the opposite of fear. The other thing, the opposite side of the coin with these demonic beings as far as fear, is that they themselves are fearful. They are scared to death of good. They're not the brave beings that they often try to depict in movies, like, how they'll depict some demonic being and they'll depict this being as strong and fearless and, no, they're not. That's Hollywood. Much of which is itself Luciferian, as we know. Much of the individuals in Hollywood, many of the producers and the executives in Hollywood themselves are Luciferians, are quite literally Satanist pedophiles, to state it bluntly. So that's why, of course, in many of their films, they try to depict demonic beings as being courageous and fearless and charismatic and strong. In actuality, it's known both scripturally, but also by other people who have encountered such beings, but also by myself, because I have encountered quite a few demonic beings, both metaphysical beings, but also human beings who were quite demonic. They are scared to death of good. They are scared to death. If you want to see a demonic being cry and run away, just be good in its presence, and yourself be fearless. If you yourself are fearless in the face of a demonic being, you will see them fall apart in front of you and run away from you as quickly as their little baby feet can take them. They are the most fearful cowards on earth. That's why they do everything in darkness, because they're afraid. You see, we do everything in the light. We do everything in the open. That's how you know a demonic being from a good being, is that we don't hide ourselves. So, yes, this is how we know how to conquer these beings. Number one, we understand, be fearless. Because if we're scared, oh, they love that. That's like food for them. That gives them a little bit of what they think is power. And then conversely, understand how actually scared they are. They try to put on a brave face because they deal in illusion. They deal in lies. So even though inside they're shaking and they're scared to death and they're dying inside in your presence as a good person, they try at first to put on a brave face. Well, get past that brave face. They're a paper tiger. You see an image of a tiger and it looks ferocious, but then when you realize it's just paper, it's just two-dimensional, and in a moment you can put your fist right through it effortlessly, like it's nothing. It's not a real tiger. It's just a facade. That's how demonic beings and demonic people are. They're just paper tigers. They look fierce, but they're nothing. Does that answer your question somewhat?
Yes, very much so. And that video is the knowledge of do not fear of Ma Shuchaha is probably one of the most valuable things I have ever been taught.
We have Krishna to thank for that. That is, of course, this of course comes from Bhagavad Gita, from chapter 18, verse 66. And yes, it's astounding. This is something that I've talked about endlessly for decades and decades, and which I can still, because it's always astounding to me how Krishna goes on for 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, just teaching and teaching and teaching the most exalted, the most elevated philosophical conclusions of the Vedas perfectly to Arjuna, to the most powerful warrior. So this work, the Bhagavad Gita, is so powerful, but then he ends it in the most powerful of ways. Ma Shuchaha. Do not fear. Do not fear. There is nothing to fear. So he ends the Bhagavad Gita with basically what I was just saying, that yes, fear is our enemy. And fear is the food of the demonic. And when we face demonic individuals, what we are to do is ma shuchaha, have zero fear and just look them in the face and stare them down, because they have nothing to them. They have no power, they have no vitality, they have no strength. And this is how Dharma triumphs, is that yes, we have zero fear.
That perfectly answers that question. Thank you so much for the insight.
My pleasure.
I think we have this one. Obviously, we can go into great detail on questions, but perhaps we can just use a few more minutes of what we have left before the outro and the talk you wanted to give to cover this one very briefly, if we think we can. If we can't, no worries. We can cover it a different time. Because it ties into the idea of Satanism, and I think it's very important to not mince words, as you always give us very good insight by not mincing your words. Can practices that are normally negative in nature be intentionally practiced and used in the pursuit of good, or will they always lead to corruption?
There are some negative attributes and actions that actually can never be transcendentalized. There are indeed some that cannot. So, for example, characteristics such as envy and jealousy can never be transcendentalized. And the reason why is because these characteristics are the reason why we have fallen into illusion to begin with. They are the very foundation, the very basis of illusion. So this is why a person can't say, oh, well, I'm going to use envy as a tool to support Dharma. No, that's an impossibility, because it's quite literally the opposite of Dharma ontologically. In its very being, it is the opposite of Dharma, and it's not merely a tool. And again, the next time we can certainly go a little bit deeper into this if you want to.
Yes, I think we would definitely be very interested in going into that. But with that, we have about 10 minutes left, so it would be good for you to say what you would like to tell us.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, again, I want to thank you very much for organizing this. This is the fourth time that we've gotten together. And not surprisingly, but always interestingly, it seems that each time we go a little bit deeper and deeper, become a little bit more blunt in what we speak about and everything, which is actually very good, and the way that things should progress. But again, thank you very much for organizing this, and I look forward to speaking to your group again in the future. And what I wanted to end with is actually just discussing very quickly a verse from Bhagavad Gita itself. And I was teaching one of my students long distance about a week ago, and we went through this verse. And as we went through it, actually, it inspired me to talk about this verse today for the group here. And that is Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, verse 42. And this is a well-known verse. This ends chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita, where, of course, Krishna is speaking to Arjuna. And at this point, of course, we understand that Arjuna represents us in so many ways. He represents what so many individuals today in 2019 are experiencing. And that is, what is Arjuna experiencing? Why does the Bhagavad Gita even commence as a dialogue? Well, Arjuna is going through enormous depression. He's going through existential anxiety. He's questioning everything. He's questioning who he is, what is the meaning of life, why does he find himself on this battlefield about to engage in this historic action that's going to take place. But the most important thing is he is in complete depression. And he turns to Krishna. And at this point in chapter 4, Krishna had been instructing him very, very deeply in Vedic philosophy and yoga very specifically, yoga philosophy. And we can see at this point that Arjuna is beginning to become his true self again. He's beginning to understand who he is and what his actual goal in life is and what the goal of life is. But still, he's not quite there yet. That doesn't happen until really the 18th chapter. But still, Krishna says this to Arjuna to end this chapter and to continue this attempt to rouse him to his true self. And let me just read what Krishna says here. Krishna says, "Therefore, the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance should be slashed by the weapon of knowledge. Armed with yoga, O Bharata, stand and fight." Again, about a week ago, when I was doing this long-distance teaching with this one student of mine, and I went through this verse, I was just astounded, and of course I had read this verse 100 times, but I was just astounded by how much this verse is speaking to us today, and it's giving us a message that we need to know, that we need to hear. And that is this. Quickly, I'm just going to go through this. "Therefore, the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance." Number one, this is the thing that we need to understand, is that this is another thing that people are experiencing today tremendously. It's doubt. Doubt. An artificial doubt. A doubt in oneself. Self-doubt. Doubt in our reality. Doubt in God. People will often question, even good people. They see suffering around them so much and they start to wonder, is there a God even? Oh, I don't know. They start to doubt everything. But from whence does this doubt come from? It comes from ignorance, according to Krishna. It comes from a not knowing. It comes from a not knowing wisdom and what is truly the meaning of life. So Krishna explains to him that the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance should be slashed by the weapon of knowledge, by the sword of knowledge, by the sword of wisdom. It is indeed by gaining true wisdom that all of our doubts can be eradicated. And when we talk about wisdom, what do we mean by wisdom? Of course, we're not talking about modern books written by some commercially oriented so-called spiritual teachers. We're talking about the most ancient of wisdoms. Like Arjuna, if we wish to eradicate our doubt, we need to take shelter of the Bhagavad Gita. We need to take shelter of the Vedas, of the Upanishads. We need to take shelter of the most ancient writings that exist. And not just the Vedic writings, all ancient writings. I've read them all. I've read literally all the epics. I've read Iliad, Odyssey. I've read so many of these epics, and they all contain tremendous wisdom within them. We need to dispel our doubts by this knowledge. And then Krishna says, armed with yoga. Interesting. Again, when I was speaking with this student, I pointed this out, how interesting it is that Krishna says, armed with yoga. In other words, with yoga as your weapon. See, this verse is speaking to the Dharma warrior. This verse is speaking to individuals who see themselves or who wish to be strong individuals fighting for truth. Not just speculating about truth, not just thinking about truth. Not just that, they have an interest in truth. It's interesting. I could be reading the Bhagavad Gita or I could be playing a video game. Today I'll read the Bhagavad Gita. No. This is speaking to individuals who are dedicated to truth. And interestingly, in this verse, Krishna says, using yoga as your weapon. So again, this comes back to the theme of the Dharma warrior. A Dharma warrior is an individual who is a warrior and a yogi, an individual who wishes to perfect themselves spiritually, but who also wishes to stand up for truth bravely, courageously. So armed with yoga, stand and fight. Two things, stand and fight. So first, take care of yourself. First, having rediscovered that strength of who you truly are, stand up. Don't be a slave anymore. Don't be a slave anymore. Don't be a slave to previous bad conditioning. Don't be a slave to erroneous ideas that you had about yourself and the world that were forced upon you, foisted upon you, given to you by the media, by a very bad educational system, by institutions, all of which have been designed, and very expertly so, in order to brainwash us and teach us the opposite of what is actually reality. But instead, throw that all aside, find your inner strength, stand. But don't just stand, then fight. And what this means for us today is, of course, not literally. It doesn't mean that we literally have to engage in physical confrontation. That's not what Krishna is saying here. It means stand and do everything in your power to teach people truth, to teach people Dharma. This is what this verse is saying. So this is a verse that people truly need to know. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, verse 42, where Krishna is speaking not only to Arjuna, he's speaking to us today. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this verse is just kind of as a continuation of how I ended our last interview, and that is by asking everyone who hears my voice to please do everything in your power to help to spread Dharma, help to awaken others, help to bring others to light. You know, it's interesting. I think a few of you are aware, but probably not everyone, that since the last video of the last interview that we did, and I made that appeal at the end, we have had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individuals reach out to us in one way or another through a variety of different ways, email, social media, in every way imaginable. We have had so many people reach out to us and ask to help and volunteer, and others who want to interview me, and on and on and on. Individuals who are joining our cause. And that is something that I am, of course, eternally grateful for. And we need to increase that tenfold as a start, then 100-fold, then 1,000-fold. What I want to do is just very, very briefly, just repeat what I said before, and that is this. We have a world to save. Our mission today, if you consider yourself to be a Dharma warrior, if you consider yourself to be an individual who is dedicated to making this world dharmic again, we need to do everything in our power to save this world. And that means we must do this as one united front, as one united people. We have to pool everything that we are, all of our resources. And we need to, like a force for good, we need to save this world. So again, I just want to make this appeal. Please help me in every and any way that you can. Share all of the videos that we have on our Dharma Nation channel. If you haven't gotten our books yet, please go to dharmacentral.com. Please get all of those books. Give them to others, other individuals who you think will be interested. Help us in every way that you can to simply get the word out. The more people who see our videos and read our books very specifically, the more people will be awoken. And they are waking up now in the multiple tens of thousands, thanks to your help. And with that, I will end there. And thank you very much again for arranging this.
Yeah, thank you enough as well for allowing me to play my part in that, and for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us. I can't give you enough thanks for that.
Absolutely my pleasure, and quite literally so. You know, people get pleasure in different ways. Again, some people get pleasure in video games. Some people get pleasure roaming from bar to bar. People get pleasure in watching a movie, a variety of ways. This is how I get my pleasure, is by sharing the teachings of Dharma and dedicating my very being to saving this world. So it's literally my pleasure.
Again, thank you so much for the time. And I really, really don't want to detract from what was just said. But before we ended, I did need to give credit where credit is due to the half-eaten hot dog analogy. I was struggling to stay upright after that one.
Well, I'm known for many things, including my interesting analogies. So I'm glad you appreciated that.
Yes, thank you so much. So we won't take up any more of your time. And please, I'm not the one who unfortunately does the emails, but reach out to us anytime, and we can definitely do this again if you desire.
Absolutely, definitely. Well, thank you so much, and everyone, please take care. And with that, Namaste. Jaya Bhagavan Shri Krishna, Jaya Shriman Narayana. And victory to Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma Vijaya. Please take care.
Take care.